Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders, viewable on YouTube and Oppenheim TV. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, as part of our ongoing series on homelessness in America, we're chatting with leaders from the organizations Deborah's Place in Chicago, including our special guest, Kathy Booton Wilson, Chief Executive Officer, and Rosie Drumgoole, the board's vice president, and Rosie is also CEO of Chicago Cares. So thank you both for joining us. It's just wonderful to have you. And let's just get right into it and talk about what makes Deborah's Place so unique, Kathy. Could you give us a sense of how Deborah's Place fits into the ecosystem of those who supply services to the unhoused in Chicago?
Yes, thank you so much for having us. We're really honored to be here today. Deborah's Place serves individual, unaccompanied adult women who are experiencing homelessness in Chicago. So that makes the population that we serve very unique in that they do not have children with them. They're not part of larger family systems, and they are all female or female identified individuals. We are one of only two agencies in Chicago that specifically serves unaccompanied adult women. It's a forgotten population. It's an underserved population. And even back when we began, what we learned was that there were shelters available for families and women with children. But as far as for individual adult women, there were no shelters or programs specifically for women. So as we enter this year, which is our 40th anniversary of serving women, we really continue to focus on that need because unfortunately, the need has not diminished in our 40 years. It has gotten greater. In addition to serving a very unique population, the way that we serve them is really special as well. Of course, we provide case management, we provide health services, we help women find housing, we help them gain an income, we provide assistance with mental health and addictions and whatever someone might be going through. We do not weed anyone out who maybe is struggling with mental illness or addiction or chronic illness. We really try to weed them in because those are the women that need us the most.
Rosie, I'd like to get you involved in this because one of the things that I think is so interesting is the intersection between the work that you do with Chicago Cares and Deborah's Place and what caused you to want to be a board member of this other nonprofit. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that actually works in your mind?
Yeah. So I am privileged enough to work at an organization called Chicago Cares, and our mission is to mobilize volunteers to build a stronger, more unified Chicago. And as part of that work, we partnered with Deborah's Place to provide volunteer services. So we would have a group of volunteers come and play bingo once or twice a month with the women there. Really, the goal there was to continue to build a sense of community amongst the women who were living at Deborah's Place. And I had the opportunity to volunteer there a couple times. Actually, also, we did a financial coaching session with some of the women. So I got an opportunity to go and really not just be there, but actually get to meet the women and feel a part of the community there. And I had a friend at the time who was a part of the Young Professionals Board at Deborah's Place, who was tasked with building the brand of the organization, doing some fundraising work. And she asked me if I wanted to be a part of that. And I said, sure. I was a younger professional looking to build my network, and it felt like it was a good fit. And I got hooked. I don't know a better way to say it. I think at Chicago Cares, we talk a lot about relationships and how, all change happens in the context of relationship. And you can't build strong relationships in community if you don't get connected first. And I think Deborah's Place is such a beautiful place because it's so warm and so welcoming. It's easy for people to come. And I think we have preconceived notions about what people experiencing homelessness look like, what they where they live and how they show up. And I think by coming and volunteering and having experience, you get to kind of turn those preconceived notions on their head. And so that's why I think I was really attracted to become a part of Deborah's Place. And then an opportunity presented itself to join the governing board. And so honestly, it was one of those things where I had somebody kind of poke me a little bit and was like, you've been on the young professional board for 3 years. You should probably go join the big board. And so I had a conversation with the previous executive director, and it felt like it was a good time for me to kind of take that bigger step, that bigger commitment to the organization. And I haven't regretted it since.
So, Kathy, when you're recruiting board members and your fellow board members are recruiting other members, what is your orientation? Because there are a lot of different criterion that one can have, a lot of different standards, right? There is, of course, the old saw in nonprofits of the give-get requirement. There's also the networks. There's also professional knowledge that might be useful to the organization. How do you look at that process?
When I look at recruiting board members, I really want to have a good balance and mix of all of those things that you mentioned. So we do have a give-get on our board, but we also recruit people with lived experience of homelessness and even people that are currently being served in our programs. Are they going to be able to raise big bucks? Maybe, maybe not. We are going to modify that give-get. We're going to be flexible because we know that the expertise that they're bringing in is going to balance out maybe the financial contributions that another board member might be able to bring. We have people like Rosie who have extensive nonprofit experience, and that's really helpful. I personally appreciate that because I feel like Rosie really knows what I go through as a nonprofit CEO. But we have people on our board from the business world, the corporate world. There is a church that supports us, and one of the church members is part of our board. We have accountants, attorneys, architects. Really, we try to balance. And I think also in the best way we can, we try to reflect the population that we're serving, which is women who are homeless. So in terms of the diversity, racial, ethnic, gender, we try to maintain some level of diversity and inclusiveness to ensure that we're bringing in as many voices as we can.
So let me ask you about that, because one of the things that I've really been trying to grapple with and advising clients and friends in the sector on is exactly this issue. The issue of very often those people who are served are underrepresented at the governance level. And one understands that as not being an intentional act, but an unintentional one. Networks are very often fostered by people who have a stable living situation. So in a homeless situation, it's very difficult to have the networks that might be useful to a nonprofit. Fundraising, right? If you're homelessness, you probably are not in a position to do fundraising. You might not have professional competencies that are specifically required by an organization. There are very few lawyers and accountants and those types of systems people who are homeless. If they have deep expertise, they're likely to be employed and have a home. But what you're saying, and I'd like, Rosie, you to jump in on here as well, is that there's an expertise that no one has other than those who are homeless. And that's valuable to your board. Rosie, could you just comment on that from your perspective as a volunteer, how you see it? And then Kathy, if you could jump in and talk about that topic, about how representation is actually operationally useful to what you do. Rosie?
So I will say there are many moments that I have been in the board meeting, and some of our fellow board members are, they currently live at Deborah's Place and currently benefit from the programs. And they, as we're making decisions about the organization, I mean, that's the role of the board, right? Like we make strategic decisions on behalf of the organization. We support Kathy. But sometimes there are things that like we just don't know. And so having that lived experience, having that voice in the space as we're making budget decisions, right? Like we're deciding whether or not, we're going to hire, provide the budget to hire extra case managers. We're having a conversation about, do we start a program that, supports the women through job readiness, right? The staff is piloting that and they have one piece, but having the women come in and talk about, their piece, their side of it, right? That just adds a different color to the conversation that I think if they're not in the room, we don't have. And I think the other piece is it's the mission, right? It's the mission. I think it grounds us and roots us into why are we even here in the first place, right? It's because we want to support women who are working on, supporting themselves and who are experiencing homelessness, and they need people to advocate for them. And so having those voices in the room is critically important. And so for my expensive, you can't replace that.
I was going to say you can't really replace that. Also, it's not just one voice, right? Because if I happen to have an issue with mental health or addiction, or I've gone through an issue that caused me such distress that I end up on the street, but it has nothing to do with mental health or addiction. There's something else. Those lived experiences, Kathy, those are fundamentally different. It's night and day from person to person. So you're never going to get perfect representation. But if you're living next to somebody who has a different type of challenge than you do, but you're living in the same space, you're likely to be able to convey that, even if that person is not on the board themselves, right?
That's correct, Mark. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been on staff for 37 years, and every woman that I have met has a different story. Nobody experiences homelessness or even loses their home in the same way. So it's really important to recognize that each person brings in their own unique experience. One of our board members who lives in one of our facilities volunteers in our learning center. So every day she's in the learning center, meeting the other participants, helping them with the computers, making sure they have a snack or a cup of coffee. So she brings in her own expertise, her own experience, and can say, well, here's what was helpful to me when I was on the streets. But she also keeps her ears open and her heart open and listens to the other women so that she can say, here's what I see. Here's what I see that's working for us, and here's what's not working. And for me, that's really valuable. As a person who's lived a life of really privilege, I can have my own ideas and say, oh, here's what I think you need. But that's not at all what people need. They need to tell me. They need to tell us. They need to tell the board what it is that they need.
So there is sometimes an attitude that has permeated this society, kind of the top-down attitude, that the people who are funding or providing the support get to define all the terms in which the support is given, right? And if you are a person in a stable household with a stable family, with whatever the confirmed perspectives that you have, that you get confirmed every day, it's kind of tough to listen to somebody say, no, you're clueless. You are clueless. But isn't that the thing that you're opening to? You're opening people with totally different perspectives to have a voice and to be listened to and to actually be taken as seriously as I would take a business associate who lives the same kind of life as I do. That's the whole idea, isn't it, behind how you're approaching the services that you both provide, right?
It's the old settlement house model. It's how Jane Addams, who was a privileged white woman, but that was how she operated, in that the workers lived in the settlement houses with the people they were serving, and everyone was viewed as equals. I think now we have even maybe a little bit more awareness of how our privilege kind of informs our perspective, and how we really need to be able to step back and hear the perspective of people really experiencing poverty and homelessness, because we can probably never even imagine what that's like if we haven't experienced it.
Let's get back to the whole question of the women that you serve and this idea of serving women who are single, who are not connected to children right now, where you're providing help for a community of individuals as well as a community who share certain attributes together. You also made reference to the fact that there might have been women who have transitioned from another gender identity. So talk a little bit about that, because these wars over cultural wars over gender and identity and transitioning and so on and so forth, don't they pale in comparison to having a roof over your head, to having food to eat, and to being part of a community? So talk with us about how you deal with those issues of identity and community building, Kathy.
Housing is a human right. Every single human being deserves a roof over their head. I feel like gender or gender identity is secondary to that absolutely right as a human being. So as far as we're concerned, if you are female, you are female, and I will take your word for it, because who am I to say what somebody else's identity is? And does that really matter?
Let me break in. Housing is a human right. This is interesting. Does that mean that I am obligated to pay for your housing if you're unhoused?
If there are people who are unhoused in our society, then those of us who are lucky enough to have a roof over our head have an obligation to ensure that everybody else has that as well, and has food to eat, and has just the very, very basics to live. We don't know what another person's experience is unless we sit and listen to them and hear them share it. So how am I to judge why or how another person became unhoused? It's usually much more complex than just it isn't any kind of individual deficit. It's usually much more complex, and there are many more systemic factors that go into that than individual.
Who gets to determine about the quality or circumstances of the housing in that kind of idea? I mean, we're going to the heart of some really big societal issues here. So let's not gloss over this. This is a real question. Who gets to determine? What do you think, Rosie? What do you think?
This comes up a lot when in our work, right? Like, not necessarily even just with our housing programming, right? But like, even when you think about food, right? Like, that's like, what quality food do we expect to feed people, right? Like, I expect that you feed people the food that you want to eat, because that's just how we treat each other. And I think I absolutely think it is my responsibility to make sure that everyone is housed, because I think our society functions better when everyone has their basic needs met. If everyone has a place to stay that they care about, they're more likely to want to take care of that house, right? Or that home, right? If they have their stuff there, more likely to not want to take stuff from you. They're more likely to not have to, go to drugs to drown their sorrows, or whatever the case may be, right? Like, and again, I'm speaking in very high level general terms, right? Again, to Kathy's point, everybody's story is unique and different. But I do think it is our right as a society. And quite frankly, our society has a lot of excess. And I don't think, I think about, my taxes, and yes, my taxes are high, just like everybody else's. I look at my pay stub just like everybody else, and I take a pause. But I do feel like, I don't mind when I know that my taxes are going towards something that houses my neighbor or makes sure that somebody has shelter and somebody is cared for and somebody has good, healthy, quality food to eat, like that is our responsibility to our neighbors. We are responsible to each other. We're all sharing the same communities. We're all sharing the same planet. We are responsible for each other, whether we think so or not, whether we want to or not. We are. I am responsible for you, and you are responsible for me.
I guess that's the idea of a civilization, right? Of a community. Kathy, do you have anything you'd like to add to Rosie's take on this question as to who gets to decide?
Rosie said it so beautifully. I think that the people who are in need, again, tell us what they need, and they deserve the same high quality of housing that we have, the same quality of food that we have, the same choices and options, so that they're not being limited to, well, you can have this crappy apartment or you can live on the streets. Why is that the choice they have to make when that's not the choice that I have to make? So I think, I don't think I can really add to that or to what Rosie said.
Yeah, I get the sense, just speaking for me personally, that part of this is human beings negotiate over everything. We talk it through. There's friction in there because not everybody's going to have the same view. I think that's part of the solution. Part of the solution is to argue it out, right? Discuss it, disagree, figure it out, right? And it's not going to all be sweetness and light. Sometimes what you can give Kathy isn't going to suit the person who is the recipient. Sometimes they think that is, wow, that's more than enough and very generous. You're going to have all these different views, but isn't that part of what our commitment is to talk it out to each other? That's how I feel about it. What do you think, Kathy?
I think that talking it out and hearing each other is more important than ever. There are people that I love who really disagree with the things that we're saying and talking about today, but I need to understand their perspective too. They have their own life experiences that they're bringing in. And unless we can all sit down and hear each other and do it with kindness and do it in a loving way, we're not going to move past some of these impasses that we're hitting right now.
So as you move forward and you look at the greater Chicago area, so Chicago has for 100 years, more than 100 years, been a place where people come, congregate. You have a urban population density. So you have, of course, the accentuated problems that you have amongst any human group of human beings, but it's accentuated in a place like Chicago or a place like Los Angeles or New York or Houston, right? So as you look at the housing circumstance and how Chicago has dealt with housing and homelessness in the past, sometimes destroying whole neighborhoods, putting up buildings that then end up having to be repurposed later on because they didn't work. How do you see this developing across Chicago, this whole idea of ensuring that there's sufficient housing stock for the people who live there?
I'm concerned right now, honestly. I don't see us adding housing stock for the number of people who need it. I think that we are a large urban area. The resources are there, but I don't know that we are overseeing the resources in the best way that we can to make sure that everybody is taken care of. We have people from other cultures that are entering our city, as they always have, as we have always welcomed. And we want to be able to make sure that those people have a roof over their head and have the opportunities for the same good life that everybody else has. And I think that's possible. We just have to figure out how to do it.
Rosie, do you want to comment on that idea of where Chicago ought to go in terms of its housing challenges?
I mean, I think I think I agree with Kathy. I think there is a great deal of concern, especially now, I think with all the terrible things that are happening in LA, right? Like, I think that only exacerbates the limit. I mean, you just think about the physical materials that are needed to build homes, right? Like, it was already a little bit of a crisis point before. And now, I think having half of a city as large as Los Angeles, be burnt down, it's tragic. And the costs to be able to rebuild and the materials needed to be rebuilt are going to be a lot. And so, what does that mean for Chicago? Again, we're all connected to each other. I think for us, we need to start thinking, if we're not rebuilding, then how are we being creative when it comes to housing? What are different models that we could look at? I think we as a society sometimes get tunnel vision and think of things have to look one way, and maybe they don't. We have a lot of buildings that aren't being used. Are those repurposed for housing? I don't know that people are into boarding homes anymore. That's kind of out of fashion, but is that a model that we look at and maybe update for this century, right? Like, I think there are a lot of creative solutions out there that we can look at, that I just think right now we just need to lean into versus just doing things the way that they've always been done.
What a fabulous, fabulous point to go out on. Kathy Booton Wilson, Chief Executive Officer of Deborah's Place, and Rosie Drumgoole, the board's vice president and also CEO of Chicago Cares. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And please thank everybody who is part of your ecosystem. I mean, you are doing great, great work for the community. And I think, Kathy, Rosie, you both made a really important point. The solution starts with viewing yourself as one community and talking to each other and really hashing it out. There is not going to be a silver bullet. There's not one convenient solution here. It's not just this or just that, but it is navigating this challenge together, sharing ideas, implementing some of them, and then assessing and continuing. I think you both have made that point really, really well, and I'd like to thank you for it.
Thank you, Mark. We are so grateful for you allowing us to have this opportunity. And thanks also to the women we serve, because them allowing us to represent them is an act of trust, and we're grateful for that as well.